Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build Karl. Not just any Karl though, this is the Mörser Karl-Gerät, which I'm probably saying wrong. This is a plastic model in 72nd scale from Hobby Boss. This kit builds the initial version of the vehicle and can be built as the 40 version or the 41 version. As far as I'm aware, the main difference there is the guns. The 40, which I've chosen to build, has the shorter 600mm gun. If you want to see all of the sprues and stuff that comes in the box, I did a what's in the box video a while ago. There's a link in the description, so go check that out if you feel like it. Otherwise, let's get right into the gluing together of bits of plastic. The first thing I did was to glue the drive sprockets together. There is keying here, which is helpful, but there is enough play here that you might like to kajigger it a bit just to make sure that the teeth are lined up as best they can be. Then, this little cover thing goes on the outside. Very simple. You may or may not be surprised to learn that there are in fact 2 drive sprockets, so make 2 of them. There are also 2 idler wheels, which I'm building here. These don't have any teeth, so you don't need to worry about lining those up. Road wheels come next, and this does look like a lot of wheels, but it isn't wheelie. It only works out to being 8 wheels per side, and that's barely any. These are easy to glue together, just make sure you're doing things around the right way. Eventually, you'll end up with a nice pile of wheels. Not shown here are return rollers. Next, I take the hull, which is a nice big single piece, and I attach one of these little bar things to each side. This will connect with the outer frame part a bit later. Then we have this doodad, which will also connect with the outer frame part. This one is a little bit stronger owing to its thickness. Then we have more doodads. These are also frame-holdy bits, but they've got a lower bit that will connect with the outer suspension arm wheel-holdy part. I don't know what to call it. What matters is we have all these parts on in the correct positions. I glue the drive sprockets into place next. There is a small amount of play here, so I try to get them on nice and straight. There are no other wheels with teeth on this vehicle, so gluing these into place now shouldn't cause any issues when installing the tracks. At the other end, I install the idler wheels. These have also got a bit of play to them, so you might have to do some nudging to deal with that. The road wheels come next, and there's not much to say about installing these. I try to put them on as straight and neat as I can, obviously, but they're not perfect. The outer frame thing should help straighten them up later if they're not perfect at this point. Before we can do that though, I add the return rollers. Again, I'm trying to get them as straight as I can, but the outer part will help align them, especially if you put that on before the glue has properly set up, which is what I did. I'm thankful that this is a big single piece, because if it wasn't, I can imagine it being very fiddly to do. Even as a single piece it was kind of tricky. I had to press it into place in sections because it just didn't seem to want to go into place all at once, and any road wheels or return rollers that weren't exactly lined up did need a bit of convincing. While it did take a little bit of time, it wasn't especially difficult, and the result is quite nice and neat. Another good thing about it is that it should be nice and strong, which is kind of important in a kit with rubber band tracks. Before we get to the dreaded rubber band tracks though, I glue this thing together. It's an H-shaped piece of internal detail. Obviously make sure that you've got all of the parts around the right way. It can then be installed here at the idler wheel end. It did take a little bit of force to get it all the way into place, but nothing too extreme. Now, it's time for the tracks. I know some folks love their rubber band tracks, and that's okay, though I do disagree. These tracks were particularly annoying to work with. They seemed resistant to superglue, which is obviously not ideal. Not only does it make it tricky to put the tracks on, it also makes the model more annoying to handle later, when they are on, because you can very easily pull the tracks off the running gear. Anyway, I wrapped the tracks around and tried to join them at the top of the run, because I figured the join might be less visible there. I spent significantly more time than this video would suggest trying to get the glue to hold the tracks together, and it did eventually work, but I would take link and length tracks over these any day. As is usually the case with rubber band tracks, they are a little bit too tight, which means the join is under tension the whole time. I suspect the intention is that you melt these together. I don't really have anything laying around with which to melt things. I guess what really matters is, after way too much time and effort, the model has tracks now. Moving on, it's time to work on the upper hull. First, I glue this little venti thingamajigger onto the engine deck. This is shaped such that it should only go on one way. These side parts come next. You may need to apply some pressure along the length of these to get them to sit flat against the hull. There's obviously one of these for each side. Next, I glue together a pair of exhaust mufflers. I did my best to neaten these up, but they're not perfect, and you may like to do a bit of putty work on them. That said, they will be partially hidden, so in the end, they might not be so noticeable. I follow that with whatever this thing is. For all I know, these could be cylinders of pressurized sauerkraut. At this end of the hull, I add these little brackety things. I have no idea what they are or what they do, but they're not difficult to position. Then, this bar. It's probably very important and has a big fancy name that I don't know. It does go into place quite easily though. Then I add two of these things, which I assume have something to do with lifting the vehicle. Whatever their function, they're easy enough to position. There are more parts like these to add, but I chose to work on the driver's controls. This is a bunch of small levers, and because they're small, they're kind of fiddly, and their positioning down inside this little tub adds to the fiddliness. Tweezers are quite helpful here. There is a seat to go in here also, but I decided to let these bond before adding that. While that happened, I installed the rest of what I've decided are lifting points. These are spread around the hull and not particularly difficult to install. I then add this additional bit of grill or vent or whatever you want to call it. This is keyed, so it only goes on one way. If you've been around for a while, you're probably used to hearing me complain about photo etch, of which this kit has none, but I do think this would look better if it was a photo etch grill. Anyway, I add these little, I guess they're just plates, maybe armoured plates, that go around the sides of the hull here like so. There are guides for these, but I still had to do a bit of nudging to get them to look right. On top of the engine area, I add this, I guess it's just an armoured cover of some sort, and it drops into place with no issue. Next, I add the driver's seat. This is a nice little driver's area, but I think if I'd looked ahead in the instructions, I probably wouldn't have added it. You'll see why later. Alongside the mufflers on both sides, I add these little flat pieces. It is a bit fiddly to line them up, but not too hard. Do make sure that you've got these the right way up. At the front, I put these convoy lights, or at least that's what I think they are. They are a bit fiddly on account of their size, but nothing a little bit of tweezering can't fix. Next, I add these little walkways, I guess you might call them. They, more or less, slot into place with little trouble. You may have to do a little bit of nudging on the flat parts we just installed so they line up properly. And now, the rest of the driver's compartment. This little rectangle goes around the compartment, which is easy enough, and then it's got a lid, which completely obscures all of the little controls I added. Isn't that wonderful? I'm sure it could be modelled open if you wanted, but I chose not to. I follow that by installing this thing, which needs to be slotted in from below. It should be pushed up as far as it can go. Then, it's time for exhaust pipes, which, unsurprisingly, connect to the mufflers. It's a bit fiddly to put these on, mostly because there isn't really much by way of contact points to use in attaching them to the hull, so it did take a bit of fiddling and nudging, but eventually I got both exhaust pipes on, and I think they look pretty decent. Now it's time to glue both halves of the hull together. I didn't actually video the connecting of the two halves, which was a bit tricky. It doesn't just drop together. You've got to nudge things around and kind of force them to line up. Then I add glue and hold things together while it bonds, long enough for things to not just pop apart again. Next, I add the whole rear. There's not much to say about this. It goes into place pretty easily and fairly neatly. That wasn't quite the case at the front end though. This part needed a bit of pressure to go into place, and as you can probably see, there's a big gap down one side. There are small gaps on both ends that might need some putty, but this gap is really big, and I'm not totally sure it should be there. This could be because I've put something together wrong or something. I have no idea. Instead of worrying about it too much, I move on and add some details to the ends. The driver's end has this hose, for hose reasons, I guess. There's also a ladder for climbing. Carl crews love to climb. On the other end, I add well, I don't really know what it is, though it looks like it could also be some sort of hose or pipe related thing. There are also two ladders here. I've no idea why there are 2 ladders, but there must be some reason to have double the climbing here. It can't just be for fun. I do hope those ladders and such don't make it too difficult to fill the gaps in, though that is something for future Herbert to worry about. It's now time to build the gun, and I start by gluing these 2 huge chunks of plastic together. There's keying, so it's pretty simple. Next, we have the end of the big chunk, gun holder, whatever it is, and these rods go in here like so. I use the work surface to help get these lined up nice and straight. I set that aside and glue the gun barrel together. There are 2 barrels in this kit, so choose the one you want. I'm using the shorter 600mm gun. It goes together quite easily and looks reasonable, but of course it could be improved with a little bit of extra work. Next, I start adding bits to, I guess you would call this the breech. This plate goes on top here, probably for very good reasons. Then, in this side, I add this little recessed detail. Of course I have no idea what it is, but it's easy enough to place. There's another similar part on the other side, but this one should be inserted from the inside of the breech part. It was a little bit more fiddly than the previous part, and this should be done before the next step, which is to glue this. I guess it isn't really a wall, let's just call it the end of the breech. This isn't difficult to put on, though you may need to apply some pressure. I then add this, again, no idea what the correct term is. This goes on the open end of the gun holdy bit, and it should go on with the bars facing outward. These will fit into the corresponding holes in the breech part, but I found they were too long. The breech is supposed to be able to slide pretty much all the way up to the gun holdy bit. Fortunately, it's easy enough to just cut these down so they'll fit. Obviously, you don't want to cut too much off, and it is better to make 2 cuts than to find out you don't have enough bar. That would be unfortunate. Eventually, I got them to fit properly. Don't get too excited and glue this together yet though. You need to put the gun in first, but before that, there's a bit more to add, like this little thing. This will hold a piece of metal wire, which was annoyingly not included with the kit. And then, 2 more plastic rods. Why the metal rod when you could just have another plastic one like these? I've no idea. Anyway, I very sensibly inserted the gun into the holdy bit. I then superglue the piece of brass rod that I've used instead of the part that didn't come with the kit, and kajiggered the 2 halves of the gun together. I did have to trim the brass rod a couple of times, but it's better to have too much than not enough. It did take a bit of fiddling, but eventually I got it together, and it looks pretty good to me. Time to start building the, I guess you might call it the cradle. First, these 2 pieces go together like so. Then, into the 2 slots on the top or bottom or, I don't know, whatever their orientation, I add a pair of mounting brackets with a gear between them. This, obviously, has something to do with the elevation of the gun. I then glue together some more bits to form another little housing which has a gear mounted on it. This will form the other end of the main cradle part. I guess it doesn't really matter too much in which order you do things here. I started with the previous assembly and glued it to one of the cradle sides.
Are you sure that's what it's called?
No, shut up. I follow that by installing the other box on the other end, and then the other side part, which makes sense. Some of these corners did need a bit of fiddling and some pressure because it doesn't just drop together, but it wasn't too much of a challenge. Once that's together, it's time to add some more details, like this platform, which is for standing on. Don't actually stand on this, it's only for 72nd scale people, which I don't think you are. Anyway, this doohickey goes on here. This looks to be an easily breakable part, so I would suggest using some caution with it. I assume whatever it is has something to do with aiming the weapon. I add another platform on this side, which you should also not stand on, and like the previous one, it's simple, though you might need to do a bit of nudging. Then, this linkage, I guess you might call it, goes on here. This looks to be part of the elevation mechanism, and it pretty much just plops right into place. Starting with a little bracket, I add a mechanism of some sort to this end of the assembly. It consists of a few pieces, including a rod that goes up to the center of the cradle, and one that runs across the width of it. Handles should be added to both ends of this rod, and it seems like they should simply slide over the end of the rod, but I couldn't get them to fit. My solution was to trim the rod back a bit and try that, and when that didn't work, I cut the rods all the way back and glued the handles into place. It was a bit fiddly, but I think I've got it looking right. Next, I glue this little ammo holding tray.
Little, Herbert?
Yeah, I guess it's not really little if it's going to hold 600mm rounds, but this is a model. It's little. It goes onto this frame thing, like so. And this is another difference between the two variants this kit can build. In addition to the gun, the ammo tray and frame are different as well. Onto that, I add this little handle assembly, and I'm glad this is a single part. Trying to glue handles on this would be a bit fiddly. I follow that with this little support thing at the end of the assembly, and then this toothed bar thing goes into place like so. It slides through the opening in that handle part, and then onto the top of the little support doodad. I feel pretty safe in assuming that this is for manually ramming the ammo into the gun, onto which we now add some more details, such as this little nubbin. It goes into the side of the gun here, and I'm sure it's very important, so don't forget it. On the front, I attach these two, I guess they're the ends of the recuperator cylinders. They slot into the slots on the front nice and easily. I then glue the gun into its cradle thing, for lack of better words. This part's easy enough, it pretty much drops right into place. Then these, I guess you might call them retaining brackets or something like that. Whatever fancy name you want to give them, they look like they should just drop into place here, but they don't. I found I had to apply a fair bit of pressure, which was kind of difficult because of how close to the gun body the parts are. My solution was to use my tweezers in a non-typical way. It was like this on both sides of the gun, but the right side, from the gun's perspective that is, was a bit more difficult, and as a result, I feel like that side of the model looks a bit worse. I did get it together though, and I suppose that's what counts. I follow this with a control wheel. This was easy enough to mount in its little hole, but in the center of this wheel, we add another wheel. Wheelception? The first wheel was simple enough, but adding the second one made it a little bit tricky to get this lined up. I guess it would have been a bit easier if I'd let the first one bond properly before adding the second, but I'm not really known as Patient Herbert now, am I? I glue the ammo loading tray thing into place next, and there's a couple of holes into which it mounts. Nothing too difficult there. To make sure the crew doesn't fall off, I add these handrails.
Does that mean you've got crew figures for this, Herbert?
It certainly does, and these railings are another thing that I'm glad are a single part. It was a little bit fiddly to get them into place, but nowhere near as much as I would imagine it would be if they were made up of multiple smaller parts. Eventually, I got the handrails on both sides, and they look pretty good. The time has come to glue the gun assembly into place. There's a fairly large horizontal space for it, and you can put it anywhere along that space. I assume you would glue it further back if you want it to look as though it's recoiling after being fired. I mounted mine as far forward as I could, with the intent that it's been loaded and is ready to fire. At this point I thought I'd finished the build, but in true Herbert Erpaderp fashion, I missed something. These little triangular bracket things. My suggestion? Pay attention to the instructions. I quickly installed those, and bam! Karl completed. If you've forgotten, this is the 72nd scale Mörser Karl-Gerät from Hobby Boss, and I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. I wouldn't say it's perfect. After all, there are quite a few gaps around the model, which I will eventually take care of when it's time to paint, and I don't think they'll be too much of a problem. You could, of course, also take care of those gaps as you build, I just choose not to. Anyway, those gaps, and my personal distaste for rubber band tracks aside, I think it's a pretty good model. It looks very much like what it's meant to be. Very Karl. It did take a fair while to build this. How long exactly I don't know, but it was probably 4 or 5 streams, of anywhere between an hour and 3 hours each, so it is a little bit more than a quick afternoon build, but it's not a huge time investment either. And for the most part, I did enjoy the time I spent building the kit, except for the rubber band tracks. If you were watching that stream, you probably already heard me complaining way too much about those. Anyway, it's all good, and there really are worse things out there. To go along with Karl and keep him fed, somebody was very generous and gifted me this little Munitionsschlepper, and I really appreciate that. It's not quite completed in this shot, but the build video for this kit will be on my channel very soon. So keep an eye out for that, probably in a couple of weeks. Or if those weeks have already elapsed, there's probably a link in the description below. Okay, so Karl is cool, Herbert is waffling, so it's time to end the video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. If you want to hang out and watch me build kits like this one live, check out my Twitch channel, which is where I stream most of the builds you see on this channel. Speaking of this channel, be sure to subscribe and click the bell if you want to see more. And if you want to see my videos a bit early before there's any ads, consider becoming a patron or a monthly member on Ko-fi. You can find links to Patreon, Ko-fi, and all of my other things like Discord and social media in the description below. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.